All right, so it's time for another Scotty interview. And again, Scotty is the person doing the interview, not being interviewed. The person who is being interviewed is Konstantin Haase, who is one of the co-founders of Travis CI. And rumor has it that he was also an opera star once upon a time. So I'm really curious to hear about all of these stories, how Travis CI came to be, and what this opera thing is all about. So take it away. Have a great interview.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have literally just met.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, to be honest, I was sat next to someone else who I thought was you. And I asked them just now, are you ready for some difficult questions? And they ran away. So, can I just say, you are the person who was supposed to be here. I've not just randomly put you up there.
Not
That's
just some random person.
Okay, so questions can come in on the same way as yesterday on the Slido. I've had one question passed on to me already. What's your favorite ice cream?
I'm actually more of a vanilla or stracciatella kind of person, very traditional.
Okay. That's good. Yeah.
I heard yours was
mint choc chip.
Mint choc chip.
Yeah, mint choc chip. There we are.
I do like with cookie dough in there, like the.
Okay.
That one's nice too.
This could go on a while, actually. We could really move this, but maybe not. Okay, I guess we ought to say, first of all, just tell us who you are. Because I really want to make sure I have got the right person up here.
Yes, I am Konstantin Haase. The last time I checked.
Prove it.
I have my ID over there.
Okay, so what do you do, Konstantin? Let's just give a little bit of where you are now, and then we'll talk a bit how your story, how you got to where you are now.
So I'm one of the co-founders of Travis CI. In case you've heard of us, our logo has been on screen a few times. The best continuous integration solution out there. And I'm the head of the engineering department at Travis at the moment.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for agreeing to do this interview. Well, I assume you agreed and you weren't press gang to be here, but here we are. So, open source. Let's start there. How did you get into open source to begin with?
Yeah. So the context there is that I got into open source and then into the tech scene beyond open source. I actually started. So I started writing software in my free time as a young child, so to speak. And what really got me into open source, actually, you could say, was the Cold War.
Okay.
Because I'm from Eastern Germany originally, and at reunification, it didn't have a proper phone network. So they put in a new phone network and made it all fiber, which ironically meant that you couldn't get fast internet because Western Germany didn't have fiber, so no one was offering internet over fiber. So even though it was great cables, you only had 56 kilobits like dial-up modem. Some people had copper cables, so they could get like DSL broadband. A friend of mine had that, so we set up a Wi-Fi connection, some 800 meters long, with like special antennas, and then we started connecting more rooftops, and we discovered that other people were doing that. In Germany, that's called Freifunk. And so we started connecting all the rooftops, and when I left town, it was some 240 rooftops connected.
Cool.
And so the first open source project I worked on was actually a Linux kernel module to change the Wi-Fi routing algorithm, which is something I would not dare touch today. But back then I didn't know any better. And yeah, so that's, and some open source projects around that. That's what got me into Ruby and things, and then, yeah.
Okay, so most of us start with, like, you know, a new wrapper for NSLog or something. It's our first touch around open source. You decided to connect 240 rooftops and change the Linux kernel.
Yeah.
Okay, so we can guess you're fairly ambitious.
I don't know. I just didn't know better, so to say.
Well, that's a good way to go.
Yeah, also because I think because of the age I started at, when it comes to programming itself, I do not have like imposter syndrome or something that a lot of people suffer from. I do have that with many other things. Like when I started talking at conferences, that kicked in hard. But with programming, I never had this like, oh, maybe I won't figure this out moment.
You just assume it can be done and get on with it.
Yes.
It sounds like a fairly cool attitude, actually. So you started there. So where did that draw you next? I mean, where did that take you?
Well, I went to university, studied IT systems engineering, and was mostly just dabbling in open source things. So I would actually say I was doing random open source things that I found interesting. I was going to the university on the side. Actually got government funding for going to university, which is a common thing in Germany, which essentially meant that I did not actively pursue having a job. And started working on Ruby projects, mostly because there was like a comic out there with foxes that explained Ruby, and I found that was hilarious. So started doing Ruby around 2005, went to university around 2007, and then mostly was working on things because people didn't, like, my main driver was I can't believe no one is doing this. So I started working on a micro framework / library called Sinatra. I'm not sure if anyone has done any Ruby.
Who's done Ruby in the room?
Okay, cool.
Okay.
And then that wasn't well maintained, so I started cleaning up things. There was a giant pull request with some 140 commits where I was just gardening the other open pull requests. And the kind of frustrating thing in the end was that the back then maintainer of Sinatra was working for GitHub, and he was very aware of the pull request and thanked me because they used it as an example pull request when they were developing GitHub pull request 2.0. Anyway, got the commit bit, became maintainer, did that for a few years, and started going to conferences. And doing that, never had what I would call a normal job. I think at my height, I did 23 conferences in a year.
Okay, that's a fairly serious amount of conferences.
and then I had people back in Berlin, Josh in particular, who's sitting up there, pitch me on starting a company together around open source.
Okay, so the next question was, how did you get to be in a company? But I did promise I'd ask, what do you think of this guy over here in the front row?
He's a very lovely person.
Oh, that was such an opportunity there, wasted. Never mind.
We can have that conversation over drinks again.
Okay.
Without it being live streamed.
So you were approached by the company. So how did that? What happened there? How did that all come about? What were your fears, your excitements, your concerns?
Yeah. So Travis was an open source project before there was any idea to create a company. And I was using Travis to some extent, mostly because I was actually running a CI setup for a lot of popular Ruby projects at the time, and it was very frustrating. It was back then it was called Hudson, what is known as Jenkins today. And I was 4 times a sponsored open source developer, so that was a concept that already existed for me, and talking with some people I knew from the community. And in the beginning, Sven, another of our co-founders who invented Travis, also had that idea to get some sponsorship to have me work on it. But that didn't work out. And then a few months later, Josh and Sven decided that they want to start a for-profit business around this open source tool. And that was right when I started my master's studies. And I really hated writing academic code. Because it was this, like, you write the most horrible code just to essentially prove the point of your paper, and then wait 20 years until someone starts using, like, your discoveries in actual software, and then essentially tell them that's like, well, this isn't new and exciting. That's like, I wrote this paper ages ago, but no one can use your code. And so I wanted to essentially write meaningful code. I'm also, if I'm just talking too much on one topic,
that's all right, don't worry. I will interrupt when it. Yeah. If you see them yawning or sleeping.
So I was kind of fed up with university, and then at the time that Josh actually really started pushing me to join this endeavor, was also around the time that, like, exams were coming up. While I was already being quite fed up with my postgrad studies. And there was like the situation where we had dinner, and my girlfriend was there, and they started discussing that she could then plan the company Christmas party, and it was clear that at that point I had to join in and had to do this.
So the first thing your company did was plan its Christmas party?
No, this is now 8 years ago. We have not had a Christmas party.
So we could obviously say that your original company plans failed then, would be fair to
absolutely.
say? Okay, exclusive here. Okay, just talk us through a little bit this concept of open source and a profit-making company, because how does that all sort of work?
Yeah, so in the beginning we weren't actually sure. We actually started with a crowdfunding campaign, and we said we want to do 4 things. So first of all, Travis CI predominantly is a hosted service. Today we also have a on-premises version, but back when we started the company, it was an exclusively hosted service that is free for open source, or back then it was just free because there was no commercial offering. And in the beginning, the resources, the hardware was sponsored. Now it's all paying for itself, but back then that was all sponsored. And then the concept of making money with that came later. We started with a crowdfunding campaign, and we said we wanted to accomplish 4 different things. One was multi-language support, because in the beginning it was for Ruby, and now it's for anything you can run on Linux, Mac, Windows, iOS, Android, and so on. And we wanted to add more language support. We wanted to build pull request support, something that I'm missing right now in the commercial offering. And we actually started building the first 3 things first, because we thought like, all these people from the community are donating money, and it would look really bad if we took that right away and started building a for-profit company out of that funding. Turns out we actually got quite some upset emails where people were like, you keep launching this feature and that feature, and it's nice, but I actually paid you some money because I want to use this for my commercial software as well, and not just for my open source libraries. So it was kind of the business model came knocking on our door rather than us building this great concept no one came up with before. And yeah, so we launched a separate service back then, like a completely separate setup, as we didn't want to use the sponsored hardware for it, which to this day kind of still exists. We have travisci.org, which is the free version. But we want to shut that down because we want to merge them into 2, not because we want to stop offering the free service. And we have travisci.com, which was the original commercial offering, which is like a subscription-based service. And I do think in that way it's actually not super unusual. It's more like a common software as a service business, just that our code happens to be open source. And anyone could go and run it, which is actually an excellent driver for our on-prem solution, because people go like, I got it running, but it was so hard. Can I just pay you money to make this work?
So do you purposely keep the software hard to use?
Not purposefully. Not purposefully. But it's a very complex beast, very complex distributed app that we've built. But it is possible to run. I've seen people do it. Not often, but I've seen people do it.
There are some rare unicorns who can get it going by themselves. So why do you think you were successful? Because, I mean, other people have tried this as well. I mean, and obviously you're not the only people who are being successful, but what do you think what would you be the keys to your success in this, do you think? If you look back now, you may not even known it at the time, but you look back now and say, well, that was important and this was important in our success.
Yeah. So I do think there are 2 very big areas. One is we stumbled upon a solution for something that people really needed. Like today, hosted CI, it's like an obvious thing. But I do think we actually shaped the market there. Like we weren't the first one. There was a tool called Run Code Run that shut down in 2010 because they didn't manage to make it sustainable. But back when we started, everyone assumed CI is something that on a regular basis isn't working, that takes forever, and configuration is a mess in filling out some web forms. And I do think part of that was just luck, and part of that was exactly that Travis was not built with a commercial solution in mind. Travis was built for the open source community by open source developers that wanted to solve their own problems. Like, I need this tool to solve my problems, and when Sven started it, it was something he did in his part-time for some libraries he maintained. And it just turned out to be so useful that we turned it into a commercial offering that is now used by, I think, more than 700,000 developers directly. And then there's, of course, all the users that use all our competitors that are modeled after our product.
So, I mean, are you still bigger on the open? I mean, how does it sort of compare? I mean, obviously, open source was your first thing. I mean, I'm assuming it's still used a lot in open source. How does that compare to your commercial side?
Yeah. So, just sheer number of projects-wise and usage-wise. So sheer number of projects-wise and number of users, open source absolutely dominates. I don't have the exact numbers, but I would guess probably 80 to 90% of our users are open source users, and 80 to 90% of our projects are open source projects. But the vast majority of them are not heavy users. So we have some, I don't have the up-to-date numbers, but the last time I looked at it a few months ago, we had some 1.2 million software projects on the hosted side that have ever used our hosted product. We don't have the numbers for our on-prem solution. We only have the number of customers there. And the vast majority is open source, but they produce about as much load on our system as the commercial usage. So it's a fairly even 50-50 split between the two.
So obviously you were or still are, a sort of geeky developer, coding, hacking type of person, and you're now a co-founder of a company. Was that a hard, how does running a company or being part of a team running a company work for you? What did you learn about yourself or the whole process in doing that?
Yeah, I learned a lot, and also what my role is kept changing and keeps changing. Like, titles is one thing, but also what I actually do at work changes every few months. And there was a lot of learning. There was a lot of learning of things that then turned out to be really important and interesting that I would not have cared about if you had told me upfront. Like, if I had a course in university about what EBITDA and ledger and budgets and whatnot is that you need for running a company, or communication and teamwork and decision-making processes and so on, I would just not have cared. Like, I set out on that path because I wanted to write meaningful code. I wanted to work on something that I liked working on as a programmer. All these things became super relevant, and I also actually got some professional coaching on some of the topics, and we discovered a lot of that ourselves as well. Once I had kind of a stake, like once that was about this product, this company, this team that we've built, then suddenly, like, even what our vacation policy is or something like that became an interesting topic, high-stake topic. And that just going through that process was something I was not aware when getting into, but was then super valuable. What I personally did for a very long time is approach many of these problems as coding problems. Okay. There even is a phrase at Travis CI for like Konstantin apps. So we were working on a salary framework, is what we call it, to have fair salaries at Travis CI, which is a a distributed company, and I was working on that with someone from our HR team, and of course I did that as a Sinatra app. So we actually do have a salary application that people can sign in with single sign-on and like see our salary levels and where they are and things like that. And that was for a very long time how I approached things until like two to 1 year ago when I got really good at spreadsheets, which is like how I think how other people approach these things.
So you just kept writing Ruby code because you didn't really want to learn how to use a spreadsheet.
Exactly.
I could put these 3 numbers in a spreadsheet, or I can write an app.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Would you say you're the type of guy who, you're saying about you were learning these things and getting some professional coaching? So obviously, learning new things, taking them on board is really important to you. Were you the type of person, or are you the type of person that sort of says, "Here's a problem, it's on its way, I better get some coaching," or are you more like me? That problem has just slapped me in the face and is now actually going down the road down there, I better sort it out? Or a bit of both?
Both. It really depends, because I'm also very good at problem avoidance. That was actually the biggest learning for me, is like the getting over myself and like, I really don't want to tackle this problem. In the past, I approached that with actually going away and working on some other interesting problem, which is also where a lot of the Konstantin apps, which is half of our internal tooling at Travis, or at least the original versions thereof, came from. But I'm usually the type of person who overanalyzes whatever problem I'm tackling, like in all the complexity and aspects. And coaching for me is just one tool in learning about a problem. So I usually research things way too much and go way too much into detail. Which also, so one of the things I needed to learn, for instance, is to make unqualified statements. That is a thing that was really hard for me, because I always made statements that were very limited in scope and then started listing the exceptions and things like that, which sometimes as a person in a leadership position made it harder to give actual guidance to people or communicate clearly what my fundamental message is that I want to communicate.
Cool. I relate totally to your overanalyzing. I think it's probably something that lots of engineers do when they're trying to do non-engineering problems.
Yeah.
We've been trying to buy a document scanner in our office for about a year. I mean, we've probably got to spend $100 and get what we need, but every time we say it, we end up doing loads of research and we end up specking out like a $15,000 scanner that we might end up with just to do some expenses receipts because we just overanalyze everything. So totally get that. Totally get that. Distributed company, despite the fact that we're in the modern connected age, distributed companies are still not the norm.
Yeah.
And particularly in the tech industry, the tech industry still loves gathering people into offices and making them sit on interstates or motorways and queue to go to work and find spaces in parking lots. So how does that work for you? How do you find that?
Yeah, most of our problems were actually the other way around. It's because we did not do the classic thing of like, we have an office and now we hire one remote person and that's not working out, but we build out our remote team and are distributed friendly or something. For us, because we started as an open source project, we were actually distributed from day one. Both in the beginning, we had a large portion of outside contributions. We actually still see some outside contributions. But also, when we started, we were essentially 3 developers in the company on the project and 1 non-developing founder. And then a few months in, we had our 5th founder join us. And we were 2 people in Berlin, Sven and me, and then Josh at the time was in Amsterdam. So we were distributed from day one. And we actually, for the first 2.5 years, we worked just like an open source project. So we did not do any big coordination, any work planning, any roadmap planning. We were just working on whatever was important, up to when we were 10 people in the company. And in the beginning, that was fantastic, because there was like no overhead whatsoever, and we all knew what to do. And we got things shipped so quickly in the first few months even, which I think contributed to our success. But then 2.5 years in, each of the 10 of us was working on like 5 projects, and we didn't get anything shipped anymore. So that's actually where we started building processes. So there's a good side to how we approach things. That is, everything we did was built with a distributed company in mind right away, from how we communicated, first in Campfire, then in Slack, to how meetings work, how documentation works, and so on. But the big downside also was we made a lot of mistakes along the way, because we had this strong not invented here syndrome in the beginning, where we just made up all our processes and things. And things like participation is really important to us, but it took us quite a lot of trial and error to figure out what works for us.
Just out of interest, who here works for a distributed company? I hope you said yes, because you know. Okay, so who commutes to an office every day or most of the time? Okay, that's the vast majority. Who would like to work for a distributed company? Cool, that's interesting. Not everyone wants to. Yeah. I wasn't suggesting. Did you notice everyone? You can take names.
Not really in the mobile app space, though.
So, what would you say has been the hardest part of this journey so far?
I do think, for me personally, the hardest part is figuring out where my boundaries are. Like, I've definitely gone significantly beyond what I can mentally and time-wise, energy-wise sustain, to the extent that 2 years ago I actually kind of hit a wall and needed to take like 2 months off because I was not a functioning human being anymore. I mean, there's a lot of things I wish I had known, essentially, of how to run a company. But I do think the biggest one is like sorry, my English. Like setting my boundaries, being able to cope with stuff, but also tackling problems that I don't want to tackle. Especially in the beginning when we started, I was very, very good at conflict avoidance, which in a leadership role that I was kind of moving into is not the best attribute to have. And that required a lot of me not just fighting my own habits, but first admitting that I need to do that, which is way harder than just reading up on a technical issue and learning whatever about hardware or software.
Yeah, I mean, conflict is really, we all probably try and do it. Although it is, lots of leadership research is showing that actually we should be encouraging conflict.
Yes.
What we should be doing is training ourselves how to deal with it, not avoiding it, but There we are. That's a different subject. We've received the question, I mean, maybe you won't be able to answer this one because you've always been a distributed company and always an open source, but someone said, if you had to point out 1 or 2 things for a company that wasn't distributed, that was about to try it, what they should look out for? It's a couple of tips there.
Yeah. So there are 2 big areas, I think. One is you need to structure everything in the way as if your company was distributed. Like the biggest issue I see with a lot of companies, and even we suffered from once we rented an office, is like you don't want to have this like second-tier employees that aren't in the office, and that is from like really important meetings. But a big aspect is actually also the socializing level. Like, how do you make people stay in touch, give a home feeling to, and that is a tricky problem even for us. How do you have the water cooler sheds. How do you get to know people and so on? And then on the other hand, documentation, communication asynchronously, how that works, because a tendency also with a distributed company is to overload people with calls, which is kind of the counterweight to the first aspect. But with every, essentially stop having in-person meetings other than one-on-ones, for instance, unless you fly everyone to the office. But also work on, everything should be written down, essentially.
I mean, as someone who works remote all the time, I can say there's a big difference when you're working for a company that is distributed, because everything works for you, as opposed to being a person who is distributed in a company that's not set up that way, and you find you haven't got access to 50% of things, or 7 meetings happen you never knew about, and I think it can make you feel very disconnected. So thank you for that. We're running out of time, sadly, so just maybe time for a couple more questions. I mean, you started with open source. If people haven't dabbled in the open source space yet, how would you encourage people to get involved?
I mean, I'm not sure I would encourage people to get involved. Open source can be a very... But getting started is fairly easy. Just in whatever software you're building on top of, there is probably open source. So maybe just get involved in the issue trackers, in discussions, go to conferences and approach people, or start working on the actual code, contribute back. But those are very, very obvious things. A big part is the community, and I think it's also easy to not feel as part of the community, and I think that's more a personal feeling than an actual in-crew, out-crew thing. I wasn't aware that I was a big part of the community, even at a point where I was already the maintainer of Sinatra for 1 year, and then when I started going to conferences and people started greeting me, I was like, I have no idea what's happening. So it's a lot about actual working on the code, but it's also a lot about making some connections, having discussions. And I do think the trick is to not be scared about that. But also when you really get involved with open source, keep in mind that you don't owe anyone anything, because it's really, I've been there and I see that with a lot of people, this once you start getting really involved, this open source guilt, that I've built this library and now they're using it and here's that feature request, and then when you still have your life, you still have your job, you still have your family, and you might, it can actually be quite overwhelming if this is not your job.
Cool. We can't finish without talking about the opera stuff.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I actually come from an artist family, so I was kind of the black sheep, and well, not the black sheep, they're all very proud of me and everything, but me being more interested in computers than in making music was an outlier. And so my mom always assumed that I was going to be an artist. I went to musical school and everything, and so through those connections, I ended up starring in a proper Baroque Handel opera called Rodelinda when I was 9 years old as Flavio, which is a silent role, but I got to wear a wig and walk around on stage and everything.
Do you still sing?
Karaoke, I do.
Okay. Well, coding? If we find you at your desk, will there be a bit of a tune going on?
I sing significantly less than Josh does.
Okay. Should we be looking for a duet? The fear on his face right now. We won't force it. We won't force it. Okay. Konstantin, thank you very much for your time and sharing your journey and your story. I've personally found it fascinating. Hopefully everyone here has as well. So thank you very much, Konstantin.
Well, thanks for having me.